Steve Russell, Slug Russell. Okay, so Steve is at the very end of the table. He was one of the people that really put all this stuff together, SpaceWar and the PDP-1. And I'm sure there's all kinds of opportunities tonight where you're going to hear where this really started that many years ago, 40 years ago. We had a birthday cake. We celebrated the 40th year anniversary of SpaceWar, one of the very first games that really came to play. Nolan Bushnell. Needs very little introduction, okay? One of the founders of Atari, and of course, Chuck E. Cheese. But an entrepreneur, an innovator, a community builder, all the things that really make the computer industry what it is today. And you're gonna hear more and more about his stories and how that had an impact on the game industry and what it was like back then to really make it all happen. And we're thrilled, our third moderator, I think we would call Stewart Brand, of all the things that he has done in his life. He's really been created a number of institutions, the New Games Tournament in 1974, the Hackers Conference in 84, the Well in 85, Global Business Networks in 87, and the Long Now Foundation in 1996. And of course, he's probably best known as founder, editor, and publisher of the Whole Earth Catalog. And any of you that have grown up as I have, and today is my birthday, but I'm an old guy now, I certainly remembers that Whole Earth Catalog. So let me turn it over to Stewart, and I think we're gonna have a great panel and discussion interactive. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Boy, have we got a codger's jamboree here or what? Ancient males twitching with nostalgia. Other people watching them do it. This is a smart museum. There's a quote, there's a whole nest of DEC, digital equipment stuff over in the other building. And prominent on one of them is the following quote from Ken Olson, who was head of DEC, speaking in the 1960s. I'm not sure what the context was, someone here may know. He said, "Computing is serious. You shouldn't treat it lightly, you shouldn't have fun with it. It shouldn't be exciting. It should be formal and distant with red tape involved."
That's good.
Well, I first saw SpaceWar being played in 1961 or 62 at Stanford at the Computation Center, or whatever they called it then. 10 years later, in 1972, just about the time that Nolan was cranking up Atari and Pong and so on, and 10 years after Steve Russell and his buddies had invented SpaceWar, I wrote the following in Rolling Stone. It came out in December 1972 and got a lot of people at Xerox PARC in trouble. They deserved it. They wanted it too, actually. Anyway, what I wrote at the beginning of the article was, reliably, at any nighttime moment in North America, hundreds of computer technicians are effectively out of their bodies. Computer projected onto cathode ray tube display screens, you had to explain this then, locked in life or death space combat for hours at a time, ruining their eyes, numbing their fingers, and frenzied mashing of control buttons, joyously slaying their friends and wasting their employers' valuable computer time. Something basic is going on. And I wrote about SpaceWar, described it, and had to explain a lot of this stuff. And in the course of it, doing the research, I called Steve Russell on the phone, and from a phone booth and with one of those suction cup tape recorder things. And he described, 10 years later, some of the things involved with designing the game. And I designed some games myself at that point and was involved later with the New Games Tournament. And it was very interesting to hear the kind of things that he had thought about. He said, one of the important things in SpaceWar is the pace. It's relatively fast-paced, and that makes it an interesting game. It seems to be a reasonable compromise between action, pushing buttons, and thought. Thought does help you, and there are some tactical considerations, but just plain fast reflexes also helps. It was quite interesting to fiddle with the parameters, which of course I had to do to get it to be a really good game. By changing the parameters, you could change it anywhere from essentially just random, where it was pure luck, to something where skill and experience counted above everything else. The normal choice is somewhere between those two. With SpaceWar, an experienced player can beat an amateur for maybe 20 to 50 games, and then the amateur begins to win a little. By the end of the article, I did a lot of stuff about what was going on at Stanford AI Lab and Xerox PARC and so on. And recalled that back then in '72, SpaceWar got people in trouble. It's part of why you played it at night. IBM banned it for a while with their researchers, and then when the research went downhill, they unbanned it because things got too joyless. And important stuff was coming out of SpaceWar. At Stanford AI Lab, they referred to graphic time sharing as SpaceWar mode. In other words, it was pushing the capabilities of time sharing at the time. So by the end of this, I was writing that SpaceWar, if anyone cared to notice, was a flawless crystal ball of things to come in computer science and computer use. One, it was intensely interactive in real time with the computer. That was new. Two, it encouraged new programming by the user. That was interesting. Three, it bonded human and machine through a responsive broadband interface of the graphics display, a live graphics display. Four, it served primarily as a communication device between humans. Five, it was a game. Six, it functioned best on standalone equipment and disrupted multiple user equipment. In other words, it was a push toward personal computers. Seven, it served human interest, not machine. SpaceWar is trivial to a computer. A lot of research at the time was trying to make things that were basically interesting to the computer. SpaceWar was not. And eight, it was delightful. So starting with Steve Russell and then following on with Pong and Atari and the basic making of a mass medium of video games, computer science shifted and the world shifted. And we're lucky to have two of the guys who started that shift and pushed it over various edges right here. I'm going to put some questions. We'll do that for a while. You're invited to put questions to each other, by the way, because you know more than I do about what's really interesting that you did. And then after a while, we'll go to questions from the audience. Nolan, I talked a lot about SpaceWar because it's the one I know about. I'm less well acquainted with your world, and it would be helpful for the audience to get a sense of what were kind of the breakthrough games, starting with Pong, I suppose, that made Atari such a force.
Well, the basic thing that we started with was a game called Computer Space, which was an attempt at a commercialization of the Galaxy Quest or the SpaceWar game. Mm-hmm. And our objective really was to make it cheap and to commercialize it. And the thing about Computer Space was that all my friends loved it, but all my friends were engineers. It was a bit above the heads of most of the bar-going public at the time. And so the next attempt was to do a driving game. We actually had a contract with one of the Chicago manufacturers to do a driving game. And that's when I convinced Al Alcorn to join me and gave him what we thought was a throwaway project, which was a training thing so that Al could get up to speed on sort of the technology. And damned if he didn't do a really good job and make a game that was really fun, which turned out to be Pong. And so we had the game, and I thought, geez, let me see if I can substitute that for the driving game. So I flew back to Chicago, and they turned it down. And coming back, we found Al had his fateful service call in which he went to the machine, and I said, the thing has to be reliable. Of course, we were 3 days into it, and we have a service call, and that was when the cash box had completely filled up. And I felt, that's a problem we can solve. And so we were stuck with a game that had been turned down by our benefactor, and so we had no money. So I said, well, let's build it anyway. And so we bought as many parts as we possibly could based on stealth and guile, and built them and sold them for cash and never looked back. The part of the story that a lot of people don't realize is that we actually had a minority market share of Pong. We probably had, what do you think, Al, a third market share maybe? Yeah, because we were very heavily copied. I mean, the good news was that Pong could be built in a garage shop. The bad news that anybody else that had a garage shop could build it too. and our patents hadn't come through yet, and so we were pretty much stuck. But slowly but surely we beat the bastards, and it was.
What were other games that in gatherings like this, people raise their hands and they want to talk about some game that they loved or that changed them, that changed the industry? What are some of the other Atari games that were big events?
The second game that we did was a game called Space Race. We did Space Race, then we did Pong doubles, then we did Quadra-Pong. We kind of ponged it to death.
And Octopong, I got the trend
Octopong,
here.
yeah. Then we did then one called Gotcha, which was really a stinker. And then we did, I think the next one after that was the Track series, wasn't it? Grand Track, and then Grand Track almost put the company out of business. We designed in a hybrid circuit and failed to pay our supplier. And it was like a 2-month lead time or something like that. And of course, we didn't know we'd run out of the hybrid until we'd run out. And so we were shut down essentially for 2 months, which was, in a company that had no money, was really devastating. So as a result, whenever people call me, they say, "Nolan, I'm about to lose my company." And I say, "Well, how many sheriffs do you have in the front lobby to attach your assets from the judgments that you've lost and collection suits?" They said, "Well, we don't have any, none." I said, "Well, you've got a long time."
And have you considered death threats to your vendor and stuff like that? Right? Well, Pong was recognizable, I guess, because there was ping pong in the world and people knew some of those moves. And SpaceWar came out of a context. And I'm curious looking back, like with SpaceWar, what books were you guys reading, or what was your frame of reference that would make it be SpaceWar?
The Lensman.
Go on.
I noticed that recently someone was claiming that George Lucas took some inspiration from the Lensman series in Star Wars. The Lensman series was a science fiction series written by Doc Smith, and it was published in pulp science fiction magazines, or a pulp science fiction magazine, and the heroes went racing around the universe being pursued by the villains, and while they were running away from the villains, they'd invent new technology and just barely managed to defeat the villains just in the nick of time. And in the next book, it turned out that they were only the agents of the forces of pure evil, and the real force of pure evil was indescribably more horrible. And so it went on. But the racing around in space and inventing new technology, and discovering whole new fields of physics on the fly was lots of fun.
So you were reading this. Were your buddies at MIT reading this?
Oh, yeah. They suggested.
And talking about it, or I'm just curious how these contexts build.
Well, several of us had read it, and then the PDP-1 appeared with this display. And there was a kaleidoscope program that Marvin Minsky wrote, which was called the Minskytron.
So I didn't know
that. You could set the starting values for its random number generator and put spots spinning around on the screen. But they'd usually die out, and it didn't have very many interesting patterns. And so you could try fiddling the buttons and start it, and fiddle the switches and start it. And it really got boring very quickly. And that didn't seem right. And there was so there was this big display, and some of my friends who were at the Model Railroad Club were also undergraduate research assistants on the
Were all you guys in
PTPY.
the Model Railroad Club, did Steve Levy get that right? Is this really this whole revolution just came out of the Model Railroad Club in MIT?
Yeah, it was the place to discuss these things.
Okay, miniature trains, miniature spaceships, I get the trend here.
Well, and part of the Model Railroad Club was about controlling the trains, and this was more of controlling, you know.
Did you do the trains competitively? Did they fight
No,
against each
no.
other?
We had, it was more of, can you keep them on schedule? And
It's interesting. So the trend here is going from fighting the clock to fighting each other
yeah.
through the computer.
Yeah,
That's interesting.
and so anyway, here was this opportunity. These guys had done a symbolic debugging system. I was using the IBM 704 at the time, and here you made a large card deck. We eventually ended up with 12,000 cards. And you took them down and gave them to the operators, and a few hours later, if you were lucky, you got back a pile of paper about that big, and you got to wonder what happened. And it wasn't very interactive. And
That was batch processing, yep.
what they had done over a weekend was write an assembler and a debugging program which took the symbols from the assembler and would type back something very close to the program you would put in and allow you to modify it and change the variable values and everything. And I thought that was a very interesting thing, and I wanted to learn more about it. And so here was this opportunity, and here was the problem, and here was this display that could obviously do more, and not very interesting program that was the best demonstration there was for it. And so we started talking. And
This is you and how many other people?
what?
This is you and how many other people at MIT?
Oh, 5 or 10.
Interesting, okay.
Some of the people, various friends, and people at the Model Railroad Club. And so the space program was just peaking at the time.
That's right.
And one of the things that was clear was that people did not understand what maneuvering a spaceship was like. And so I said, well, gee, you know, we could simulate that. And so I thought about it. And that was easy to do. There was a little problem about making the spaceship turn, but I eventually figured out a trick for that. And then Alan Kotok, I kept talking about it, not doing anything. And Alan Kotok came back from Maynard one day with the source for the sine and cosine routines and says, here's the sine and cosine routines, now what's your excuse? And so I sat down and started writing. And I got the version that just ran the spaceship around. And we threw on some, and then got the torpedoes going and that sort of stuff. And
Was
put some random.
Was it multiple player from the start, Steve?
Yeah, well, we didn't know how to make the computer artificially intelligent enough to play it.
Bingo.
Much easier to use human intelligence.
Yeah.
So then Pete Sampson said, well, your random stars are not very interesting. You should have real stars. And he wrote a program called Expensive Planetarium, which was about 1 page of code and a bunch of tables, which displayed a star map that gradually moved across the screen. That was good. And then Dan Edwards said, well, you really ought to have gravity. And he rewrote the display in a much cleverer way and got gravity calculations going between the spaceships and the sun. But there really wasn't enough time to do gravity calculations for the torpedoes. So they were photon bombs, they were weightless.
Doc Smith would be so pleased he invented the way out of that.
It wasn't our invention.
And then people were playing it right away. I mean, you could do a demo like that and then it just dies. How come it kept going?
Well, we very quickly had to make a rule that playing SpaceWar was lower priority than anything else you could do on the computer, including writing new versions of SpaceWar.
Right. So then this group of 5 is starting to play and they keep playing it? Is that what happens? And
Well, it was, open and they told their friends. And so, lots of people in the IT community came around and saw it and played it. And
how did the code get around the country? Is this paper tape
Well-
going through the mail or what?
eventually DEC started shipping it with PDP-1s.
So despite what Ken Olsen said, that's pretty interesting.
Well, the story, I haven't actually, this is a third-hand rumor, I have no personal knowledge of this, but the story was after they got rolling in, the 20th or 30th PDP-1, that what would happen would be the checkout technicians, just before they packaged up the machine, would load in SpaceWar, and it was core memory, so it would remember if you were lucky. And then the field service guys would unpack the machine and check things, and when they powered it up, they'd start where SpaceWar started and see if it ran, and if it did, then they'd call the customer over and say, see, it works.
That's great. Well, that's further proof that video games, part of what they keep contributing to the industry is they're always pushing the edge of what's possible with the software and hardware that's currently out there.
Well, and there was this blank screen. It was such an opportunity, and there wasn't anything there.
Well done. Nolan, so we know how come it was space. How come it was ping pong?
Well, I just wanted to amplify a little bit what, because as an undergraduate, I can remember going into the computer lab and seeing the screen and seeing the game and being absolutely hooked and mesmerized as a user. And
you played it.
Played it, and it was a thing where school became less important. And because basically you'd have computer access maybe from 2 in the morning until 6, which really played havoc with an 8 o'clock class. But I was working summers at an amusement park, and I was running the games department. And it was very easy to see that if I could put this in the arcade, that it would earn a lot of money. But you divided I played it on an IBM machine. I don't think I played it until about 1965. Was when I sort of came on the thing. And by that time, it had been ported over to an IBM machine that was run in the graphics lab of Dr. Evans at the University of Utah. And you divide the math, 25 cents into this, $7 million computer, I think it was at that time, and math didn't work. And so I filed it away, but I can remember one particular fall quarter in which I was truly obsessed with the game. Truly obsessed.
And there were others of your ilk, clearly, that you were playing against.
Clearly. I mean, we would draw lots, do stealth and guile to keep the other people from coming in because didn't necessarily want it to share too much. But it was powerful.
Yeah, I've drawn a parallel. This is the 60s, and there were drugs going on, and for a select few, there was expanded consciousness of computers going on. And the difference between those two new technologies was that basically the drugs kind of plateaued and stopped getting better, and the computers just kept getting better.
Yeah.
So it was a much more wholesome addiction.
Of course, you got to understand that I was in Utah, and that's 20 years behind all that other stuff. So,
So why Pong? I mean, it's clear that you tried to make, and bear in mind, this is super open source stuff, right? I mean, people are totally sharing things.
Yeah.
Improvements came along, new features that people liked, they would be incorporated, and it was free for everybody, as I recall.
well, with Pong, we started feeling very proprietary about it, and we were trying to make money on it. So we set forth to keep Pong from being repeated in terms of ending up with a third market share of our own game.
So did you try to copyright it or patent it or what?
No, we felt that This was the early
Undermine the
70s.
competition? What
This
was
was the
it?
early 70s, and so we didn't necessarily trust government institutions to protect us.
Because you read all that science fiction in which it was always a libertarian who won the day.
Right. Well, what we did is we basically said we'll just outthink them, and so we designed products, and then we would change the chip numbers. So that any copier would come along and think that they had it, and they'd plug in the chips and it wouldn't work. And we even went so far as to design in a couple of parts that were somewhat obscure, and then we went out and tried to corner the market. Like there was a couple of gates that were relatively cheap, 15 or 20 cents a chip, but there weren't very many of them made. And one day we found out that we'd cornered 120% of the market. And of course we.
That's not like paying twice for the same thing. Right?
Well, it turned out that we didn't have really good systems and controls in place, so there were a lot of the chips going out our back door and coming back in the front door.
Modern chips.
Yeah, so that was.
Did it work?
Well, we fired the warehouse manager, and that helped. But it did work. We were able to slow the copiers. We were able to step by step basically control the market. I think in 1978 we had close to an 80% market share in the coin-operated game business, and pretty much maintained that through that period of time. And this was a company that started with $250. You know, we never had any money, but we learned that stealth and guile, as opposed to capital, can sometimes work.
And cheaper, yeah. Well, it's interesting to me, when I was writing about this in '72, SpaceWar was pretty much the same as it had been in maybe '62 or '63, when most of the basic feature set was in. You had hyperspace and stuff like this. It was tremendously stable for 10 years. All the time Moore's Law was
Longer
cranking
run
away.
than any other computer game since.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's amazing that, you know, in a sense, the first game would sort of dominate the roost for that long. And basically until you came along with Pong and arcades and a mass market for what had been a very niche market, to put it mildly. Once you have a mass market, I mean, the niche market, you're getting feedback from a very high level of customer, and you hear from them because there's not so many. Once you have a mass market, it must be a different relationship with customers. What was that like?
Well, you basically climb on the pattern of you've got a business to run. How can you possibly, how can you keep your factory full?
Had you done business before, by the way, or were you learning on the job?
Oh, I was definitely learning on the job. I had my own little advertising company when I was in college, and that's actually how I got involved.
That explains a lot, Nolan.
Well, I took a blotter and put a calendar in the middle and sold advertising around it and gave it away free at the beginning of each quarter.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And that was my daytime job. And then I went to work at the amusement park to keep myself from spending it on girls and beer. Because I always had a pretty good ability to spend money. And so I thought I'd get myself out of harm's way. But but I found out that the amusement park was really a nice adjunct to that. But we didn't know what we were doing. We were just problem solving every day.
How soon did you have competitors that worried you? As opposed to the ones that you could sort of stomp the way you were doing it initially, that real competition?
The big guys were all in Chicago, and they had technology that was based on relays and solenoids and that sort of thing.
It's interesting how much this was a hardware game. You could protect it by hardware, and competition came from hardware stuff.
Yeah, but what we did, they were the ones that I was worried about, and I was also worried about a company called Ramtech who came up, and they had technological underpinnings. And so we embarked on two strategies. The first strategy was to try to keep the big guys in Chicago who had the factories, who could basically, build stuff at 200 a day if they needed to. We wanted to keep them from investing in R&D. And so I had Alcoin go out and buy all the holograms that he could find. And we had one of our distributors who we knew was a backdoor to all the Chicago manufacturers. And so we brought him in and said, no, this is really on the QT, but these video games aren't going to last. The most important thing is 3 dimensions. And we took him back in this dimly lit room with these holograms and everything, and it's very impressive. And I just wanted them to start investing in holographic technology. And the funny thing about it is that they actually came up with one. It was an absolute turkey, but it was, you could just see that the president of the company had gone to engineering and says, you got to build a holographic game. And so they had do you remember what that game was, Al? It was something, but it was a horrible game, but it had a hologram on it. And it didn't make any money, and it was a total failure. But I think we were actually able to hold it off a little bit.
I was intrigued by some both engineering and game playing issues that you got into. In particular was, if you could recount what happened when you started to mess with the precision of the torpedoes.
Oh, yes. I was very much into realism, really trying to teach people what flying in space was really like. And so at one point I said, well, gee, the torpedoes are dead accurate. And real world torpedoes and weapons aren't dead accurate. So I'll put in a little random variation in the direction and the speed so that they have some dispersion like real guns. And boy, did I get a bunch of grief on that.
Did you slip it in, or did you tell people
I
they were
put it
getting
in
fuzzy
and
torpedoes?
told people about it, and I got it flamed. Well, it wasn't called flaming at the time, but it was
The equivalent thereof.
the equivalent, not delivered by email either, but
Well, how do you explain
personally.
that? I mean, you
And-
just made the game more realistic. Everybody loved gravity. That was realistic.
Well,
You
but
introduced a little fuzz. What was the problem?
Why do people buy Craftsman and Snap-on tools? People like good tools.
Why do they buy
that work well.
AK-47s, which never jam?
And so I had to put it under a switch option, and eventually nobody used it, so eventually I took it out and used the space for something else. But
I think it's a general lesson. Basically, anything that is acting like a weapon, people will get absolutely the best they can. And that's the way it is, folks. It was proved in 1962, and it's still true.
I actually think, though, that video games have in fact benefited from the accuracy of the simulation to the certain extent. I think that it's very satisfying to people to have highly predictable situations when they want it to be highly predictable.
yeah. It's, no one complained about the rocket exhaust looking random or things like that. It was only when the torpedoes didn't hit what they were aimed at, when they should have.
And in fact, if there's another person that should be sitting up here, it's Ralph Baer, because he had some very important pioneering work in the Odyssey game. And if you really look at the difference between what Ralph did and what Atari did, it really comes down to his was primarily an analog device, which didn't have a lot of the accuracy and precision that the digital brought to it. And the market just swamped in favor of the accuracy of the digital.
Interesting.
And really, had a brief fling with the analog, but really soon tired of it.
I was impressed in games that I watched in early virtual reality stuff and so on that speed of response was way more important than resolution of the graphic image.
Yes.
If you had an instant feedback, that was important. You could have stick figures fighting or something. but that was of the essence. Did you find that in the games you were messing with?
Absolutely. I mean, of course, we were constantly fighting cost, because up through, asteroids, these were all state machines. These were machines that were essentially signal generators, that the hardware was the software. I mean, they weren't even close to von Neumann machines. I mean, remember the 4004 wasn't designed until 74. And so if you say 72, couldn't have been based on a microprocessor. And so we constantly were making how good the graphics are compared to what the cost was, because it added cost if we put stuff in it, which the software didn't allow. It didn't mean that. Just run a few more bits. So
Well, no, we were out of time and space too.
well, yeah, you guys, you had a vector graphic, so you only had X number of inches.
No, we had point plotting graphics.
Right.
But slower, yeah, 50 microseconds per point, thank you.
Wow. Yeah.
And we did fill up the PDP-1, the available PDP-1 memory, and in fact, one of the debugging tricks was you didn't load the stars when you were debugging. You used the debugging program as the table for the star map, which didn't look right, but it allowed you to play at breakpoints and find out why the code was running away.
Incidentally, before we did computer space, we actually, my effort and the innovation that I was bringing to it was actually to get it to work on a regular television set. I mean, my original design was with using a Data General 1600, driving 4 or 6 monitors, and I kept running out of time, and yeah, I was a little bit optimistic. I think it's a historical characteristic, but I kept running out of cycle time, so I had to keep making the hardware smarter. And I kept running out of time, and because I knew that the economics and the amusement part had to have certain cost structures, and I felt that I could get there. I amortized the cost of one computer over multiple screens and multiple coin slots, and I got down to three monitors, and that was at the threshold where I felt I could not go any lower, and couldn't get the math to work, and actually sort of went into a funk for about a month, saying, yeah, I've wasted my time. I can't do it. It's not going to be economic, and that sort of thing. And then I had the aha, heck, I won't do a von Neumann machine at all. I'll do the single-purpose fixed idea. And all of a sudden, then the costs came way down, and we were able to sell the early computer spaces for $1,200. That means we had a manufacturing cost of about $500. That's fiberglass cabinet.
Marked down from 120,000 for a PDP-1.
Right.
Yeah, right.
That's why they call it expensive planetarium.
Yeah. So it was so that was kind of the process, and I ended up with a better, much better place than I originally thought it would be.
So what you learned from the arcade games then played over into what you were doing when the Atari was a box you could take home. How did that connection get made?
Well, that's really a lot to do with Al. Al had a good friend who was a chip designer, a guy named Harold Lee. And we felt that the home market was an important one, but it was going to be very, very difficult to hit the cost points and the reliability. We were actually more worried about the reliability because you have a professional service staff and that, but in the consumer marketplace, things break, it costs you a lot of money. And so I felt that we should move in that direction, even though we still didn't have any money. Growing companies, in fact, Al just gave me a memo that I had given him in 1973. When
This is going into the museum, right?
And Al and I always had an unholy alliance. He thought that I was totally nuts most of the time, and He was the voice of
Still
realism.
does, judging by his nod.
And so Al was always the voice of caution and reason, and I was the voice of, yeah, we can do it. We'll figure it out what to do when the time comes. And,
You're a clever fellow. I'm sure you'll be able to figure it out when we have to.
Yeah, that's kind of the way I looked at it. And the consumer marketplace was just too tempting. Of course, when we first got the thing working, took it to the toy fair, we sold none, zero. And then we tried the appliance business, the brown goods, you know, televisions and stereos and things like that, sold none. And so we were very, very nervous. And if it hadn't been for Gene Lipkin, who was our vice president of marketing at the time, he says, well, maybe Sears Sporting Goods. Tom Quinn. And the next day he was on our front, in our front lobby. He asked us how many we could make, and we hadn't really thought of that. So we hastily, we went out in the hallway, and I said, how many do you think you can make, Al? You said about 20,000 maybe, you know, in a year. So I went in and told him 75,000. But he trumped us and came back with an order for 150,000.
Actually, I had a similar experience with the Whole Earth catalog at about the same time, which is started in '68 and was distributing it by hand. Personally, I would take it to bookstores. And, would you like this? What is it? And about that time, there was a distributor in Berkeley called Book People, who invented themselves around basically alternative distribution of books. And we were their kind of prime alternative book. So they put us on the map, we put them on the map, and it was a nice case of being able to march in tandem. Without Book People, Whole Earth Catalog would have stayed a kind of limited subscription thing, I'm sure. So finding the right distributor at the right time.
Boy, it was really good. Well, we actually had to call Tom about a week later and said, you know, this order for 150,000 is all nice and good, but there's no way we can build it. You know, we don't have the money. And he said, well, let us introduce you to Sears Bank. And they created a bonded warehouse at the end of our production line and advanced us 80% of our sales price every time one of them dropped off into the bonded warehouse.
They did this with a loan?
What?
You got a loan from the Sears Bank, or they?
No, they just, it was basically an inventory line in which they advanced us money the minute the product was made, which was all that we needed. We had enough working capital to get the parts going. We just needed to, we just couldn't. See, in the consumer market, you either have a great big factory that you run during the month of September, or you have a little factory in a big warehouse, because everything happens sort of between September and
I've been there.
December. And, you know, we were in a business where we were collecting money on Wednesday to pay the payroll on Friday. And so clearly that didn't work to support a lot of inventory.
But usually it's the other way around. The payroll you missed last Friday, you try to make up part of it.
Yeah, we did a lot of that. It became part of the Atari culture to get to the bank first with your paycheck.
This wasn't confined to Atari.
Oh, no.
Well, Steve, say a little more about your story sort of after the first round of SpaceWar. Did you stay involved with the game or move on to other things or what?
No, I was doing various other things that actually paid money. And I moved out to Stanford and for the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Project. And we did a multi-user PDP-1, so there was a PDP-1 to play SpaceWar on. And that was where I learned that SpaceWar was an arcade game. Because when we had been working on the PDP-1 and working late, and we went over to the Oasis, a local bar, to have a hamburger and some beer, and came back afterward when they closed. And there were a couple of guys who had been playing the pinball machines at the Oasis, who were playing SpaceWar on the PDP-1. Ah. It is an arcade game.
Yeah.
So you swam uphill toward quarters.
What?
You swam uphill toward quarters,
Yeah, well,
as Nolan did.
but, you know, it was still $120,000, which was clearly not going to make it on at the rate at which you could stuff quarters in a slot.
Right.
So I went on to other things, and
When I talked to you, you were at DEC, I think, in '72. Is that right?
what?
But you were in '72 when I
Yeah.
talked to you on the phone, you were at DEC by then?
Yeah.
Doing human interface or something?
Oh, let's see. I think then I was a junior marketeer.
I
And
seduced you over to Atari in about, what, 76?
what?
Didn't you come and work for Atari in 76?
No, that was, let's see, 86.
86, okay.
That wasn't Atari. It was,
Whatever.
yeah,
Yeah,
in the rust bucket.
right.
There was a while there when Nolan would bring in just about anybody, as near as I can tell, who was pretty smart to be part of, was it an R&D lab, or what was that weird?
It's kind of the first
Pre-college
incubator,
you had.
I think. I mean, it was.
Sorry?
It was, I guess we called it was an incubator, and it was a good, bad idea. It was very efficient. We started some very interesting companies. The real problem with the incubator is you always start a few bad companies, and it's really hard to get rid of them. So, you know, after a while, all the good companies leave, and you're sort of left with this bunch of dreck. And so the only way you can really get out of it is close it.
Well, what people were you bringing around? I mean, you tried to get Steve Russell, it sounds like, Alan Kay was around there, Jaron Lanier, but what was the sort of cadre of people who went on to great things that came around Atari?
There were a lot of very, very, very strong people. And we had this theory at Atari is that if you got the brightest people and if you created a meritocracy, and a meritocracy is really one where you try to get everyone to focus on the projects, keep the projects interesting. And it doesn't take a lot of people to do projects. And I think that what we learned is that you could start a division or start a product that was different, spend very little money and put it into the market and see if it goes or not. And if you don't get carried away with your production releases, it's a pretty good way to manage a business. And when you and one of the kind of disappointments that I had after I sold to Warner was that it was very, very clear that they didn't, you know, have the vision. I mean, we had modems. I mean, fastest modem in the world by about a factor of 10 in the Atari labs when we sold it to Warner. They closed that down.
Right.
And we were planning a telephone, picture phone, game system, and I think that we could have probably had sort of the equivalent of the internet in 1978, 79. It's kind of where we were planning it, but and that was kind of one of the difficult things that you know, when I sold Atari, I thought that I was going to have the funding to play in an ever-expanding sandbox instead of a smaller one, and there's big regrets.
Did you get good value from your especially imaginative and advanced researchers? I mean, Jaron Lanier did a game, Moon Mist, I think it was, or something like that. Yeah. Did it sort of pay his salary and his way there?
I think some of that was after I left.
Okay.
One of the problems that Atari had after I left is that it kind of got hijacked by the accountants and the marketeers, and they wouldn't let anything out of engineering because they had this vision that they were a couple of $100 million company, and so the threshold of getting anything out of engineering said that it had to be a $5 or $10 million market. Well, not everything from this end of the telescope looks like a $20 or $30 million market, but very often they end up that way.
It's interesting.
And I know that Al, you were horribly frustrated with that, and a lot of the really talented people who had sort of been used to this publish, invent, publish, to all of a sudden invent, sit on the shelf, invent, sit on the shelf. And
This is a case of you sort of believed in Darwinian evolution and they sort of believed in intelligent design, where they thought they could actually shape the whole thing and know when they had a winner and stuff like that. And you were willing to, it sounds like, figure out the winner would come later, meanwhile make it interesting.
well, it was a thing where I believe that the wager of taking a few $1,000s and create something that has the potential of being a $10 or $100 million product, that's a reasonable risk. And but if you start overlaying the, say, I'm not going to do any market, I'm not going to do any product unless I have a $5 million marketing plan behind it, then it changes your whole thinking. But if you sort of say, I'm going to throw it out there, and if I can sell them in San Jose, then I can sell them anywhere. And what's the marketing cost to get a station wagon and put some in the back of your station wagon and put them around at various places in San Jose? That's the best market test after you actually build the things.
There you go. It's even easier on the web now.
Yeah.
We're going to go to audience questions in a minute. Steve, go ahead.
I was going to say that one of the things that I realized was that one of the reasons SpaceWar was pretty good was because it was very well tested. And we had a good, clever crew of testers
Yeah.
who gave a lot of free advice. Some of it was worth exactly what it cost. Some of it was better. And in fact, in developing SpaceWar, I'm sure we spent many more testing hours than we did software writing hours.
So is this an early open source story where with enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow kind of deal? with
Yeah,
SpaceWar?
well, it was definitely open source. There wasn't any way to close it, really.
But in the sense that there were a lot of people presumably letting, I don't know, who are the keepers of the canonical version? Was that
I
part of the
was
story?
sort of the keeper of the canonical version, but the sources, I'd give the sources to anybody. After the week when we said, can we make money with this? No.
Well, you guys, we're going to go to the audience in a second. And do you have questions of each other? You've been hearing their...
Well, we've known each other for a while. I think
Yeah.
we're pretty much vetted.
All right, then, we're going to start looking for questions of the audience. We've got to pause. The cameras are everywhere they need to be and so on. Right here, go ahead.
Yeah, you were just talking about sort of test marketing, and I'm trying to retrieve an old memory.
Would you identify yourself?
What?
Would you identify yourself?
I'm Don Knuth from Stanford, and I have this vague memory that one of the earliest Pong machines was at the coffee house at Stanford. Is that true?
Actually, no, I think you're confusing it with the Galaxy game, the one that's over there.
Don, I'm curious, do you have other questions on sort of the programming level about what these guys were up to?
Okay, so how hard would it be to make the original SpaceWar code run or on some simulator? I'm always, I'm interested in source code and how many lines of code was it and things like that. A lot of the games had to really be super program skill because you had to pack a tremendous amount of logic into a small space. But you were using the whole PDP-1, you said. So I'm curious about that kind of quantitative.
Well, the PDP-1 had 4K of 18-bit words, at least the minimal version, and I wrote for that. The original, the source code eventually grew to around 2,000 lines of assembler. I didn't know it at the time because the vocabulary hadn't been invented, but it was an object-oriented design. The colliding objects were polymorphic objects. There were two spaceships at the bottom of the table, and then there were as many torpedoes as had been launched. And when two colliding objects ran into each other, they changed it into explosions. And I did the spaceship outlines and the original spaceship outlines and the physics. And Pete Sampson did Expensive Planetarium, which was the a star map display, which was the background. And Dan Edwards looked at the way I had done the display code, which took most of the time, and rewrote it completely into a compiler that compiled exactly the right code to display the spaceship outlines. And that gave him enough time to calculate gravity between the star and the two spaceships. And there wasn't enough time to calculate gravity with the torpedoes, so we decided they were photon bombs.
Now, is minimalist code like that more robust in some sense over?
Well, it's still running. There's an MIT website with a Java PDP-1 interpreter that's running SpaceWar for the PDP-1. And it has no outstanding bugs reported.
I have a question for the last questioner. Don, how many hours do you spend playing SpaceWar?
No,
Not the news.
well, yeah. Actually, I have to admit that I go into great lengths not to get addicted to things that interest me because there's too many of them, and so. But if you asked about my son now.
What about your son?
Well, I think that he got to be expert at every arcade game, and he got hooked on SpaceWar when he was 6 years old, I think.
Did that blight his life or make him a greater human being, or what happened? as a result?
Well, yeah.
Better human being. Video games.
No, he knows how to relax.
Other questions? One way and back, and a mic right by it. Go ahead.
Everybody knows that nowadays when a new blockbuster movie comes out, there's instantly a bunch of games for every platform known that come out in relation to that. I was wondering if you could speak to the collisions and the merging of the movie industry with the game industry back when you were at Atari.
Well, that was actually part of the promise of the sale to Warner. It really didn't work very well. It seemed like the Warner divisions were autonomous enough that it was almost easier to do a deal with one of the other movie companies than it was Warner, which was another one of the frustrations that we had. The probably only collaborative thing that I can remember actually happening was the Superman pinball. You remember any others than that? But it was just horrible.
Because the game was bad, or the?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, E.T. was really a stinker, wasn't it?
Next question. I see the mic is in here, and someone's hot hand.
Yeah, I was just wondering, oh, goodness.
Identify yourself.
Pardon?
Identify yourself.
Oh, yeah, Don Ravey. I was wondering about the very early Game of Life before the graphics, the old alphanumeric Game of Life. Where does that fit in the chronology?
Cellular automata and all that. The Sims certainly used it. All the Sim games use automata. Did you get into that at all?
You know, we talked about programming that in one of our things, but it was, we didn't see a way to make a compelling game out of it. It was more of a curiosity in terms of where we were. I can remember being fascinated by the Game of Life. I was first aware of it in the Martin Gardner section of Scientific American, and but that was about as much as we ever did anything with.
I think Life is an example of one of the sorts of things where the design is much more interesting than the playing.
Yes.
And I've always claimed that writing SpaceWar was even more fun than playing it, and I sincerely believe it. I noticed that a lot of the first-person shooters now have dungeon design modules.
Right.
So that you can design your own version of the game with your own decorations. And that seems to help the popularity considerably.
Not only that, I believe that the dungeon design modules were singularly responsible for getting some of my children involved in programming. That was sort of the first thing, and they were high enough level languages that I can remember going down and showing them the dungeon design modules in Doom, which was not real easy to use, but it wasn't real hard either. And I can remember them, first thing they'd do is they'd go out and these were kids who were 8 and 9 years old, and they'd make a dungeon and they'd put hundreds of weapons in it. That was the first thing. And then slowly after the weeks, they'd get into where they'd be, putting their own pictures on the walls and various things. And they felt so empowered by being able to do that, because it was a lot of bragging rights with their friends. Because
I'm still at it.
yeah, well, living in our house, it was fun to see my kids grow up, in which we had a multi-node network in our home long time ago. And so the kids would come and cluster around, and they'd be scattered all over the house playing network games. And to see how much that led to a whole series of kids being very computer literate and very interested, and trying to push the envelope more and more and more to, because once you can use the dungeon creator, now all of a sudden you want to start messing with parameters, and that starts going into at least scripting, and so their thirst for power in the programming forces them to learn more and more algorithms.
One of the first things that I had to publish in SpaceWar was the first page of the code, which was all the parameters that you could twiddle and their location, so you could tune it to suit your fancy.
That's right. So that's the first step of the SpaceWar, is deciding all those various things. You're going to have the sun and all that, the gravity and the pace of things moving and all that. So it's design interactive from the start. What little I know about cellular automata, like Conway's Game of Life, when SimCity came out, I was on the phone to one of the guys who designed it, and said, it looked to me like you're doing systems dynamics plus cellular automata. Is that right? He said, who have you been talking to? I mean, it's pretty obvious. Question over here.
Yeah, well, I can add a little to the chronology of life. My name is John Francis. I was up at Cambridge when John Conway was actually coming up with the idea of life, and I have the dubious merit of having written the first ever life program.
Bravo.
Because John Conway was playing around with cellular automata on a chessboard in the maths department, and I wandered in one afternoon and I looked at this and I thought, that is so obviously suited to a computer that I could do this. So I hopped on my bike and disappeared off up to where Fred Hoyle had a System 360 that I had time on that I could use during the day when he wasn't using it for processing his astronomy results. And the next morning I dropped 200 pages of printout on Conway's desk and said, how does this match with what you've got at the moment? And he called me something moderately unprintable at the time. And then we had a PDP-7 at the university, and this was an obvious machine with a display, and I programmed that up, and much to my annoyance, I ran the Arpentomino for 1,000 generations and gave up on it. And of course, life people know that it's 1,103 generations is when it terminates. And in fact, I also did another life program later when I was working for DEC, and the GT40 came out, and this was the first DEC's idea of a sort of cheap portable machine that everybody could have one of, and a large number of the GT40s around DEC and various of the other customers seemed to get this program on it. But this was happening, end of the 60s, 69, 1970 would be the period at Cambridge when we were doing it there.
Do you have any of the original code or stuff like that?
The original code for the
Game of Life?
For the 360, no, it was, afraid not. It was all just written and run and disappeared. I've rewritten it several times since then on, I think I did it on my Atari 1200 when I had one of those.
Well.
I had a 400 and then, or was it an 800 and then a 1200, which I actually bought for playing games on. I was a big fan of the Infocom games, in fact.
Yeah.
And the text-based games which were just coming out. I was wondering how people saw those as opposed to just the video games like Pong and Breakout and things like that. I found they're sort of, you can't really compare how you're doing with other people. You can post a high score, but you can't really post too much an intermediate progress. Whereas with those text games, you could say, oh, I'm still trying to get the bird out of the cage or whatever there.
ZYGG.
ZYZZY.
ZYZZY.
Yeah, or I got the Babel fish or things of that nature.
Yeah.
And you see that now with the Zelda games and things like that. People talk about problems that they're having, and you see the same level of discussion going on there that you used to see with the text games, but which you didn't really see with Breakout.
Yeah, the text games were fascinating, and of course, I go back to the early days of the internet with Lambda Moo and some of the others that were text-based worlds, and there is something to be said for the imagination overlay that you can get in a text game that you can't get in graphics. Like when I think of the Colossal Cave, it's a very rich environment to me, but mostly artifacts of my own imagination.
Well, and there was amazing view.
Yes, it was.
This was in Original Adventure, which was text-based, and it was a whole page, very glowing description of this wonderful view, and that was the only point of going to that room. There wasn't anything else there.
Yeah.
But this is really authorship, not...
Yeah, it was a story. I mean, it was basically Myst without, Myst without graphics.
Yes.
If you can imagine.
Some of that language got, you are in a maze of twisty passages all alike.
Yeah.
Things like that. And people realized life is a maze of twisty passages all alike.
I still occasionally announce that I seem to be in a maze of twisty passages, all slightly different.
The slightly different kid. Right here.
My name is Steve Golson. I have a comment and then a question. The comment was I worked for a company that did contract work for Atari and Warner in the early 80s. And the question earlier about tie-ins with video games. And we went through Warner's entire catalog of movies trying to figure out games that we could design that would tie in with properties that Warner owned. We tried to work on Superman and couldn't quite get that to work. We actually had a prototype running of a Road Warrior game, the Mel Gibson Mad Max movies that Warner owned, and that was going to be a lot of fun. The one we really tried to make work was the Roadrunner cartoon. Which we thought, oh, if there's anything that would make a wonderful Twitch game would be, the Roadrunner and the Coyote. And the only game we could figure out was if you were the Coyote, and that would be no fun at all. So, so we tried. My question for Nolan is, at what point did you start using microprocessors, and how was that a big change for you in your game design, going from the hardwired state machine things to actually having processors and programming? How did that change your game design?
I actually think that's a better question for Al. I mean, it was Asteroids, wasn't it?
I think, I'm not really sure, but I think it might have been a baseball game, actually. I mean, it was really not a key part of the game. It was just something to keep track of something complex. It still weren't fast enough to do graphics. So that's it. Really was. It migrated in. It wasn't a big change in the coin-op. It was a big change in the home game. So that was a big event.
It was so we always had to have so much hardware to get speeds fast enough to deal with the refresh rates.
Do we know what this crackling is coming from? Any of the engineers here are able to nail that?
Well, also we've been trading off hardware and software for years. I mean,
Right.
it's you look at whichever way the logic works best, and then you try and make it as cheap as you can, or make the engineering project cheap. In my case.
Yeah, when you were talking about how you did the ships, the rocket ships and the things, when we did computer space, we actually had a 16-bit decoder, or a 4 to 16 decoder, and in the circuit board, we actually had to insert by hand a diode for every point of light that we had on the thing. And if you look on the circuit board, you can see pictures of 4 rocket ships. And you got the complete sequence by scanning it this way, and this way, and this way, and this way, so you could get all of them around. And if you'll notice on computer space, you can never point directly straight up, or directly straight down, or straight to the right, or straight to the left. And we did that strictly to save one set of of images. We only wanted 16, and it turned out that it worked better if you didn't have it that way.
Question over here.
Cassidy Nolan, a big fan of whether it's TTL or CMOS or however you guys wrote it. When you designed a game as your undergrad, Fox and Geese was an X and O's game. Whatever was the history with that? What happened with that game?
Oh, gee. Fox and Geese was simply a, I don't know if you guys know the game, but Fox and Geese is one where you have a bunch of really dumb things that are trying to get away, and the fox is trying to get it. And that was just a really simple game that, see, I was never as good at a software guy as Russell. I mean, you know, he can run circles around me. I've always been a hack, and pretty good electrical engineer, but I've never been very good at software. And so my experiences at the university, that I can assure that anything that I wrote was fixed up by my associates and done much, much better than I ever did. In fact, I remember that I had one little problem with the artificial intelligence, because that actually did require a little bit of an algorithm to make it work. It was a pretty dumb algorithm, but it seemed to work okay. But I mean, there's emulations of Fox and Geese all over the place on the web now.
Emulation is its own interesting world. Question over here.
I'm Christopher Masters. I've got a people question as opposed to an engineering question. Has anybody looked into the age demographics of people who are playing games at this point? And if they have, how many peaks are in it? How many modes are in this distribution? And are they moving at all? Are older people playing these games, and is the mode of that distribution getting older? Are kids playing these games and the mode of that distribution staying where it is? I mean, it's like...
What's your hypothesis? What do you think it'll be?
I think the kids who are playing these games are the same age, and they stay the same age, just as children's games perpetuate through the community of children. But it may be that in the older groups who are playing these games, that they're a fixed group of people and they're getting older. And that may have an important input to where the market's going to be going over the next 5-10 years.
That's actually very germane to what I'm currently working on. I'm doing coin-operated games connected to the internet. In probably 1978 through 1983, the coin drop of the coin-operated game business was about $22 billion. Very big market, about 4 times the size of the movie industry. That's domestic US, that's not even worldwide. And it was huge. There were probably close to 9 or 10 million coin-operated games on location in various parts of the nation. And it turned out that everybody was playing in those days. I mean, virtually everybody, businessmen would play on lunch hours, what have you. Women, 60% of the cash that went into Pac-Man was played by women. A significant portion of Pong was women play. In fact, it was socially acceptable for a woman to ask a guy in a bar to come and play Pong with her. And as a result, in the ensuing years, I probably had 500 people come up to me and tell me that they met their wife, husband while playing Pong. It turns out that women have better small muscle coordination than men do. And so generally, a woman could beat a guy every time, and that was extremely empowering to women.
Plus it sorted out the men as to whether they'd put up with that.
Yeah. But anyway, right now, what happened in the 80s is that the games became complex and violent. And the violence essentially lost the female player in the public space. The complexity lost the casual male player. And that was compounded with another fact, that the economic life of the coin-operated game was truncating, which simple games would burn bright, but they would burn short. And when the games were wrapped around a piece of hardware, the ability for a coin-op factory or a coin-op company to actually bring that or put the machine on the market you couldn't make money on it. So the simple casual games went away. And this happened at the same time that the home game came along. And everybody said, well, the reason the coin-operated game business is falling is of competition with the home game. But it wasn't that at all, because if you talk to the people that were playing games on lunch hours and the women, they weren't playing at home either. They just quit playing because they wanted a casual experience, something that was, easy to learn and impossible to master. And so our games on the at UWink, we're publishing in the public space these simple games and upgrading the games over the internet every other week. We put a new game out. And so we don't care if the game burns very, very brightly.
Where do you find it on the internet?
Pardon?
What's the URL for finding these games?
uwink.com. But our games are just in bars and restaurants now. We're going back to my roots 30 years later, and hopefully I've learned something.
We'll do one more question right back here.
Hi, my name's Sam Doe, and this is to Nolan. I wanted to say that first a statement and then a question. The Atari has always been an inspiration for me as a kid. It's just my dad.
Atari T-shirt on it, looks like.
Yeah, my dad always kind of harped my butt about doing well in school, and because he was in the military, and after playing the Atari, just inspired me to try to figure out how in the heck they do that, how they move those bits around. It was just like intriguing, which made me work harder in school and kept me in school. Otherwise, I probably would have been just a dropout loser in the Midwest. But and eventually, I was able to work my way through college, and then got inspired at Symantec Peter Norton Group by one of the guys that started their own game company. Started mine in 1990, and then I ended up closing my doors in '98 due to mistakes that you make in the game industry. And when I went to work for Hasbro, and when we acquired Atari, it was just so sad of a day for me when they told me, okay, go down there, we want you to do some research. And they just handed me a key. I didn't know where I was going. I just did a little MapQuest thing. And I ended up in Salem, Mass, at a public storage in these 2 units, and it had everything of Atari. And it was just a sad day. I'm just rooting through the JAG, and I'm rooting through the Link system, and it's just unbelievable of how this huge company to me, and inspiration to me, just like is here in a public storage unit, and so that was my statement.
It's sad for me too.
I have a question for you, and we'll also ask it to these guys. What games interest or impress you that are out there now, relatively new games?
The big thing has always been for me is resource management games. I like action arcade games. My very first game that I made was like a Galaxia ripoff a la Asteroids. And I started off in the shareware market. And then I got my distribution by just talking and calling to these distributors in like Germany. And what was funny to me was I found that internationally, they were the most honest people in giving me revenue. US were constantly ripping me off, and I was always having to chase these guys down and get my money. But definitely what I am really disappointed with in the video games that I've seen lately is they lost sight of what it really is. The element, to me at least, is the game design.
You think the golden age is over?
Well, the gameplay, it's like there's only a few games out there that I can say that have the golden nuggets of actual gameplay. They've been spending too much time on animation and graphics, and it made me sick when I went to the store at Best Buy and reading I was looking to upgrade my hard drive, and it was an 80 gig hard drive or something like that, something nuts. And here it says, I can install 10 games. I'm like, what? 10 games? My very first game was under 1.5 meg because I had to get it on a 1.44 floppy for shareware, It was like when they gave me, I did a contract for IBM in Fun and Games division, made 3 games. Yeah, the game was only about 13 megs on this CD-ROM. So I mean,
First Atari carts were 4K.
Yeah.
Let's see what these guys say.
BV1 was 4K.
4K bits, whether you needed them or not.
Yeah,
Oh,
I mean,
okay. Yours was smaller than mine.
So I mean, I cherish playing those games because what kept me there was the gameplay. The art, it was just adequate enough to keep me intrigued with the gameplay. That's what I enjoyed the most. But
Let's check with these guys. What games impress you these days? Are you at all current game literate?
Warcraft 3.
Say it again?
Warcraft 3.
Why?
It's a resource management game, and I think it's a very compelling universe that they've created. It's a top-down resource management game, and it's by a company called Blizzard, and I just think it's very well crafted.
Do you play it or you just admire it?
Oh, I play it.
Okay, that's impressive. Steve, do you play any games?
Oh, yeah, I've played a number of the current supply of first-person shooters.
Right.
And I've never had fast reflexes, and so I've never been one for real Twitch games. And some of them have very good artificial intelligence. They slaughter me and slaughter me and slaughter me, and after a while they fumble a little more, and I begin to catch on to them, and I begin to win. And others of them, they just slaughter me and slaughter me and slaughter me and slaughter me, and that's boring.
Yeah.
I kind of like the Myst series, Riven and
Why?
And that, and it's almost more. I like the experience because I kind of like to visit those crazy islands.
Does it take you back to the early text games, do you think?
A little
bit.
It's a world? A little bit, but in some ways it's a virtual vacation with a little bit of a puzzle involved. Because I kind of like going to those places because they're clearly otherworldly.
I like exploring games.
Yeah.
The Empire, I always got at least as much fun out of exploring the world as
Exactly.
building the Empire.
Yeah.
And of course, Myst has a very scenic world.
Yeah.
But I get a little tired of farting around with the Myst puzzles. I'm not too fond of them.
There's books for people like you and me. Don't
Yeah.
This answers your question. If it says the demographic keep on playing games as it gets older, there's a whole cohort of folks you can see they're marching into the grave with their hands on the joysticks.
The quick question I wanted to ask.
I
just want to ask a quick question.
Do we have time for one? Okay, finish it up. Go ahead.
I wanted to ask, what do you guys think of the new G4 television channel in the cellular game market?
Cellular game market, I think, is going to be large for simple games. I think that it's, the micro screen is not going to be very satisfying for anything that's very complex other than the other stuff. The G4 channel, they interviewed me quite extensively for one of the things, and I think it's going to be an interesting area. I haven't seen enough of it to tell you whether I think it's compelling, but I think it's got to be good for the business.
Steve, any thought on that?
I don't have any strong feelings about that.
I think decades will go by and we'll keep having meetings like this, and they're still going to be talking about video games, the incredible early days and the astounding present days and the ever widening future when we'll be doing it in our glasses as we do other things and whatnot. Thank you for coming. This is a great occasion.